Hamish, Macbeth, and the New Year kiss everyone saw. On a cold Highland night, a single moment of scandal becomes the spark for a mystery that refuses to stay buried. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. Hamish Macbeth reached Tommel Castle later than he meant to. The sleet had turned the narrow road to slush, and the borrowed police car wheezed on the incline as if it hated the climb as much as he did. Lugs whined in the back seat. The dog disliked parties, noise, and most people, which made him wiser than Hamish in many ways. A Hogmanay ball was the last place Hamish wanted to be, but the Colonel had made a point of telling Strathbane that local police must show face, and Daviot had passed the order down with his usual fluttering nerves. Lugs trembled when a sharp gust rattled the old castle windows. Hamish scratched behind his ears. "We'll not stay long," he muttered. Inside, the ballroom was stuffy. Too many heaters, too much perfume, too many folk in clothes they did not know how to wear. Lochdu had turned out in force, though the clothes were mostly borrowed or dragged from the backs of wardrobes. The Colonel was roaring instructions at the band. Priscilla stood near the French windows like a pale statue, cool and distant. Hamish wished she had not seen him come in. Her eyes travelled over his old jacket, and he felt the familiar twist of embarrassment. He tried to edge round the wall, but people insisted on greeting him with loud cheerfulness. "Hamish, you clean up well enough," someone shouted, which was unnecessary. Lugs crept between his legs, miserable. Fiona Ross moved through the crowd, arranging trays and struggling with the Colonel's demands. She looked neat and capable, even in the heat, and her fiancé Donald watched her with a pride that had jealousy tucked inside it. Hamish noticed the way Donald's hand tightened around his glass each time Fiona spoke to a guest. Then there was Hugh Latimer, an Englishman with a voice like a foghorn. Hugh slapped backs and made jokes about Highland traditions. "Charming little place," he said loudly. "Bit primitive, though." Hamish disliked him on sight. The man was the sort who would punch a sheep for being in the road. The night dragged. The band was too loud. Blair, thank heaven, stayed in Strathbane, but his absence did not improve Hamish's mood. He stood near a pillar, feeling awkward, and wondered how early he could leave without being accused of spoiling the fun. Near midnight, the Colonel insisted on dimming the lights for atmosphere. Someone fumbled with the switches, plunging the ballroom into a weak, flickering gloom. Folk pressed closer, as if darkness gave them permission to behave foolishly. Lugs stiffened, sensing the noise before it came. The band began shouting the countdown. 10, 9, 8. Hamish felt the crush of warm bodies, sweaty perfume, and too much breath on the air. 7, 6, 5. Someone elbowed him and muttered an apology that did not sound apologetic. 4, 3, 2. When the clock struck, the room erupted. People cheered and grabbed whomever they could reach. A clumsy, breathless mess of embraces. Lugs barked once, sharp and unhappy. The lights came back up with a blinding snap. For a moment, there was only noise. Then the noise changed. It thinned, reshaped itself into a single startled gasp, spreading across the room. In the centre of the floor, Fiona Ross was kissing Hugh Latimer. Not a peck, not a polite Hogmanay greeting. Her hands were pressed flat against his chest as if trying to push him off, but his arms were around her. People stopped mid-laugh. Others nudged each other. Donald stared, white as chalk, then flushed a painful red. Hugh looked pleased with himself when they finally broke apart. "Just tradition," he shouted, adjusting his tie. "Nothing more than a New Year kiss." Fiona jerked away as if burned. "You grabbed me," she said, too quiet for most to hear. "Don't you dare pretend otherwise." Donald took a step forward, then another. He looked ready to swing at Hugh or flee the room. Hamish could not tell which. Priscilla's cool gaze slid toward Hamish, almost accusing, as though he should have prevented such a spectacle. Hamish felt shabby and useless. People began whispering. Hamish caught snatches. Shocking. Poor Donald. Lights were low. Was it her or him leaning in? Looked like she enjoyed it. Looked like she didn't. The trouble with Lochdu folk was that they could witness the same thing and come away with 10 different stories, all of them certain. Hamish tried to move toward Fiona, but Nessie Curry blocked him with a sticky glass of punch. "Did you see it, Hamish? Bold as brass, that one. I always said." Hamish slipped past her before she could say what she always said. Fiona stood with her arms folded, staring at the floor. Donald had vanished into the corridor. Hugh was already telling anyone who would listen that Fiona had pulled him in, that she couldn't resist a bit of fun. Hamish knew a lie when he heard one, but he also knew Hugo's kind of lie spread fast because it fitted the worst instincts of the villagers. He found Donald outside near the coat rack, breathing hard. "It's nothing," Hamish said, though he did not believe it. "Folk get daft at Hogmanay." "She wouldn't do that," Donald muttered. "Not unless—" He stopped there. It was a miserable thing when a man could not finish a sentence about his own fiancée. Hamish tried to speak again, but Luggs growled softly at a passing couple, picking up the tension in the air. Hamish had no right words anyway. Back in the ballroom, the Colonel was shouting at the band to start another reel. Entertain guests, keep spirits up, pretend the scandal had not happened in the very centre of his party. Hamish stood near the doorway, feeling the heat rise, the air thicken, the gossip grow louder. Nothing in the room had actually changed in the space of a minute, yet everything had shifted. The new year had begun with a tangle of humiliation that would live longer in Lochdu's memory than any murder. He left the ballroom with Luggs trotting ahead, tail low. The cold corridor felt like a blessing after the heat. Behind him, music thumped again, too cheerful, too loud, acting as if nothing had torn through the room. Hamish paused at the castle's heavy front door. Luggs sat at his feet, looking up with mournful eyes that mirrored his own discomfort. "This'll not blow over," Hamish said. He did not know yet how right he was. The next morning, Hamish Macbeth knew trouble had started early, when the station door refused to shut properly. The wind kept catching it, banging it against the frame with a hollow clap that set Luggs pacing. The dog kept glancing at Hamish as if he expected him to fix the weather. Hamish only shoved the door harder and muttered that January was a stupid month. The telephone hadn't rung once, which meant something was wrong elsewhere. Lochdu never stayed quiet the morning after Hogmanay. Someone would complain about drink or about noise, or about someone else's cousin making off with the wrong coat. Silence meant they were all talking about the same thing. By the time Hamish stepped into Patel's shop, the air felt thick with the sort of gossip that grew legs. Nessie and Jessie Curry were standing by the tinned soup, their voices sharp enough to peel paint. "She was clinging to him like ivy," Nessie declared. "I saw her arms round his neck." "You need glasses," Jessie snapped. "She was pushing him off. Poor lass." Hugh grabbed her. Mr. Patel looked as if he had been trapped in the same argument for hours. "People are asking if Donald is leaving the village," he complained. "Imagine that. They don't even buy anything first." Hamish took a packet of tea he did not need, and a packet of shortbread he would probably eat all at once. "Folk get daft at Hogmanay," he said, hoping they would take the hint and stop. They didn't. "Donald hasn't been seen," Nessie pressed on. "Left the castle white as a sheet." "Fiona went back to do the accounts," Jessie added, as if numbers soothed the conscience. Hamish ignored them, but the talk clung to him. Luggs, who had followed him in, whined at the door, bored or anxious or both. Hamish muttered a goodbye and escaped. The wind off the loch carried the sour smell of thawing snow. Luggs tugged him toward the path as if he sensed something. Hamish didn't like that. The dog was too often right about the wrong things. Halfway down the slope, a crofter's boy shouted. It was the sort of shout that stiffened the air. Hamish hurried, slipping once on the wet stones. Luggs bounded ahead, then stopped dead, tail low. Hugh Latimer lay crumpled at the bottom of the bank, his evening suit soaked and muddy. One shoe was missing. His head lolled at an angle Hamish disliked. For a ridiculous second he hoped Hugh would sit up and make some crude English joke. But the body was stiff, cold, wrong. The boy stood back, wide-eyed. "I only came for my traps," he whispered. "I didn't touch him." "I know," Hamish said. His voice sounded dull. "Go home. Tell your mother I'll speak to her later." Hamish crouched beside the body. There were marks in the snow. Some scraped, some pressed. He could not tell which belonged to Hugh and which to the boy. He touched the missing shoe foot, cold as the rocks. Luggs whined again, low and soft. The sound of an engine grinding up the track made Hamish wince. Blair arrived in a fury. He flung open the car door, already complaining about the drive, the weather, and the fact that villagers breathed. Anderson scrambled after him carrying a notebook. "What have we got?" Blair demanded, as if Hugh might answer. Then Blair spotted the dead man, and his mood brightened in its unpleasant way. "Och, a jealous fiancé, a drunk Englishman, A midnight shame. Very neat. Hamish felt heat rise in his neck. It's too early for that, he said. Blair sneered. You were at the castle, Macbeth. You saw the lass, you saw the kiss. Did the fiancé storm out ready to kill someone? Hamish hesitated. He remembered Donald's face. White, then red. Angry, yes, but violence wasn't in the man. Still, Blair stared at him, waiting to pounce on any scrap. He was upset, Hamish said slowly, but no violent. Blair gave a bark of laughter. You're protecting someone again. Always the Highland hero. Hamish regretted answering at all. Blair bent to inspect the body, though it was clear he had no idea what he was looking for. Anderson pretended to help. Look at the bank, Blair said. Man was drunk, slipped, broke his neck. That's the case. The crofter's boy, still hanging back, shook his head. I saw marks up there, as if someone grabbed him. Shut it, Blair snapped. Children dinna give evidence. Hamish climbed back up the path to see for himself. There was flattened snow, not much, but enough to suggest a stumble, or a struggle. A scrap of glitter clung to a twig, probably from the castle decorations, probably meaningless. But Hamish didn't like probably. He found the missing shoe a few yards away, lying stupidly on its side like something discarded after a dance. Hugh hadn't walked here without it. Someone had pulled or pushed him, or he had fought someone, or he had been too drunk to stand. Too many maybes. Blair trudged up behind him. So, shoe came off when he fell. Happens all the time. No, Hamish said, before he could stop himself. Not like this, Blair smirked. Then you can solve the case, Macbeth, since you're such an expert on footwear. The humiliation was deliberate. Blair enjoyed these moments. Anderson scribbled in his notebook as if Hamish's embarrassment were vital evidence. Hamish looked toward the loch. Grey water slapped lazily at the stones as if the world couldn't be bothered to care. Hugh Latimer had been alive a few hours ago, making unpleasant jokes. Now he lay at the bottom of a bank, and everyone would soon be arguing over whose fault it was. Luggs nudged Hamish's leg uneasy. Hamish didn't blame him. Something felt wrong. Blair was too pleased. The villagers would be too quick to believe whatever story made them feel safe. And Hamish himself had already made the mistake of answering Blair's question about Donald. He should have kept his mouth shut. He straightened, brushing snow from his knees. Blair was still talking about jealous Scots and drunken Englishmen. Anderson nodded like a toy. Hamish looked again at the trampled patch of snow, the glitter scrap, the single shoe. None of it formed a clear picture, but it formed something messy, something that wouldn't fit Blair's neat little box. This won't be tidy, Hamish murmured. Luggs flicked an ear. Blair swung round. What was that? Nothing, Hamish said. Just thinking aloud. Well, don't, Blair snapped. Leave the thinking to Strathbane. Hamish said nothing. He had already said too much today. The cold crept deeper into his coat as he stared down at the loch, feeling the quiet weight of something beginning that he could not yet name. Rain had turned to something meaner by the time Hamish reached the loch path again. It was an icy drizzle that felt like needles on the skin. Luggs shook himself every few steps as if insulted by the weather. Things were already wrong. Blair had arrived. The man stood on the path as if posing for a photograph, chest out, feet planted, a bad actor claiming the lead in a dreary play. The crofter's boy hovered nearby, pale and miserable. Blair poked a fat finger at him. You saw him fall, Blair barked. Just tell us and we'll note keep you. I didna see him fall, the boy whispered. Just found him. You're hedging, Blair snapped. Folk hedge when they're hiding something. Hamish stepped in before the boy cried. He's told you twice. Leave him be. Blair rounded on Hamish, delighted to have someone to bully who wouldn't cry. You think I need your advice, Macbeth? This is murder. Plain murder by a jealous Highland yahoo. The words hung in the cold air. Donald was being marched down the slope by Anderson, who held him as if afraid he might bolt, though Donald looked too exhausted to run anywhere. His hair was stuck to his forehead, and he had that grey look of someone who'd slept badly and thought worse. You walked out after the kiss, Blair said without preamble. You went straight down this path. You pushed him. I went home, Donald said. His voice was hoarse but steady. Ask Fiona. Ask anybody. Blair gave a nasty smile. I don't need to ask anybody. I've got eyewitnesses saying you were ready to tear that Englishman's head off. Hamish felt the crofter's boy flinch beside him. Villagers did not witness things, they invented them. Still, Hamish spoke up. Donald left early. Folk were singing. It was chaos. Nobody could see which way he went. It was meant to help. It did not. Blair's smile widened like a cut. So you're protecting him. Again. Protecting your own wee circle. Hamish did not rise to it. He only felt the familiar sinking feeling he got whenever he said anything Blair could twist. Donald shivered slightly. I walked the road, not the path. I never saw Hugh after that mess in the ballroom. Hugh this, Hugh that, Blair said, bored. You were jealous. You got angry. You shoved him. Men have killed for less. Not Donald, Hamish muttered. It slipped out. Blair pounced on it. Oh, aye. You know his soul now, do you? Maybe you were both in it together. Lugs growled low in his throat. For once, Hamish didn't hush him. The drizzle worsened. A thread of water ran down Hamish's neck, and he wiped it away with irritation he tried not to show. He sent the boy home and followed Blair back toward the road. Near the top of the path, something small caught his eye. He crouched. Mud, trampled snow, and a glint of metal half buried. A cufflink. DF scratched into the back. Blair loomed over him. Well, well, souvenir from our jealous lad. Hamish pocketed it. Lots of folk lose things. Funny how they lose them right where bodies turn up, Blair said. Back at the station, Hamish dried lugs with an old towel while Blair prowled about like a bored lion. Donald sat hunched at the table, damp cuffs folded neatly as if trying to appear orderly when everything around him was coming apart. Hamish began the statement. He hated the formality of it. He hated paperwork in general. But Blair watched him write, so he wrote. You walk the road? Hamish asked. Yes. You didn't come down the lock path? No. Hamish glanced at the damp smear on Donald's sleeve. Could have been rain. Could have been a struggle. Could have been anything. He wanted to believe the harmless explanation. He usually did. Where's your cufflink? Hamish asked. Lost it ages ago, Donald said quickly. Months, maybe last year. Blair snorted. Lost it right where the Englishman landed. Very convenient. It's mud, Donald said. Everybody walks here. Hamish finished the statement slowly. His hand felt heavy. He could hear Blair's smug breathing, which was somehow worse than Blair's speaking. When Donald finally left, Blair leaned back in his chair, satisfied. This is easy, Macbeth. Jealous man kills rival. You're dragging it out because you didn't like the answer. Hamish said nothing. That was safest. He stared at the blotches drying on Donald's cuffs. They looked harmless now. Everything looked harmless until it wasn't. Outside, the rain thickened again. Lugs paced the floor, paws clicking, sensing something neither of them could name yet. Hamish stood at the window, watching the blurred shapes of Loch Dhu through the drizzle. Villagers were already gathering in small knots. Heads leaned together in gossip he could almost hear. They would remember that bar argument between Donald and Hugh far more clearly today than they had last night. Memory in Loch Dhu became sharper when scandal fed it. Hamish rubbed Lugs's ear. Maybe it is simple, he murmured. Maybe simple would do for once. But the cufflink sat cold in his pocket, and the simplicity Blair loved so much felt like a blanket thrown over something still breathing underneath. Blair had hauled Donald off before Hamish had even finished his tea. One moment Donald was standing stiffly in the station doorway. The next he was shoved into the back of the Strathbane car like a sack of turnips. The sleet came down in thin, hard needles, and Lugs growled at the tyres spinning in the slush as the car lurched away. "You're not in charge here, Macbeth," Blair had shouted through the open window. "You never were." Hamish had not answered. There was no point. The man fed on petty triumphs. When the telephone rang an hour later, Hamish already knew it would be Daviot. The chief constable's voice had that tight flutter that meant he was imagining headlines before facts. "Hamish, we must settle this quickly. Press interest is growing. We cannot have Hogmanay murder at Highland Castle splashed everywhere." Hamish stared out at the grey sleet. "A man's dead," he said. Yes, tragic," Daviot replied. "But don't let Blair wander. Keep him focused." Hamish almost laughed at that. Blair didn't wander. He charged at the nearest answer and ignored the rest. Feeling cornered between Strathbane's nerves and Blair's bluster, Hamish left the station and trudged up toward Tommel Castle. Lugs trotted ahead, pausing every so often to shake the wet from his coat. The castle loomed like it always did, large and draughty and full of people pretending not to notice they were miserable. A maid opened the door, eyes too wide, and told him Fiona was in her office. The girl kept glancing away, as if afraid someone might see her talking to him. Fiona looked pale. The skin under her eyes was shadowed, and she held herself too straight, the way people do when they are afraid they might fall apart if they slump even a little. Her dress had a tear at the seam, badly mended. Hamish noticed it immediately because it had not been there the night before. He nodded at it. "Rough night?" Fiona smoothed the fabric, eyes flicking away. "Hugh was drunk. He grabbed me when the lights came up. Donald saw and lost his temper, but he'd never kill anyone." Her voice was flat. Too flat. Hamish did not comment. "Did Hugh threaten you?" he asked. She hesitated just long enough to make the lie clumsy. "Only with his jokes." Hamish felt an old familiar discomfort tug at him, the sort he always felt when Priscilla looked at him with that cool, distant judgment. He didn't want to see Fiona as anything but a victim of Hogmanay foolishness. He wanted the story to be simple. Hugh drunk, Donald jealous, nothing worse. It was foolish, but he chose to believe her. "Blair's making a mess of it," Hamish said. "He'll twist anything he can." "He already has," Fiona whispered. "Donald shouldn't even be there." Hamish left before she could say more. The castle walls always made him feel shabby. Outside, the sleet stung his face, and lugs pressed close to him, ears twitching at every sound. Back at the station, Hamish stared at the telephone for a long time before lifting it. He dialed Strathbane and cleared his throat. "About Donald's shouting last night," he said, keeping his voice light. "Folk were drinking. It may have sounded worse than it was. More noise than intention. It was a deliberate lie, a small lie. The sort of lie he told when he felt someone needed protecting. He hung up before he could think better of it. The lie did not help. It rarely did. Blair rang 10 minutes later, triumphant. "Grand work, Macbeth. Your wee sweetheart admitted he shoved the Englishman against a wall back at the castle after midnight. You didn't tell me that, did you?" Hamish closed his eyes. Blair's admissions were often just whatever he could bully a man into saying. If Donald had shoved Hugh away in the crush, if Hugh had barged into him and Donald had reacted, that was not the same as murder, and it proved nothing about the loch. "I never saw him at the loch," Donald was shouting in the background. "I never did." "I never saw him at the loch," Donald was shouting in the background. "I never did," Blair's voice came back on. "Near enough a confession." Hamish hung up. He did not trust himself to answer without saying something he'd regret. He stepped outside into the sleet again, needing air. Lugs pushed his nose into Hamish's hand, anxious. Before Hamish could collect himself, one of the younger castle maids arrived at the station, breathless and dripping. She hovered in the doorway like a stray bird. "Mr. Macbeth?" she whispered. "I dinna know if it matters, but I saw Mr. Latimer slip into the side corridor near the library, just after the lights came up. He had a woman with him. Dark shawl, I think. I didn't see her face." She twisted her hands as she spoke, already regretting coming. "Why didn't you say this earlier?" Hamish asked. She shrank a little. "Folks say it must have been Miss Ross. I didn't want trouble." Hamish thanked her, though she looked as relieved to escape as if the station were on fire. The moment she left, Blair arrived in a roar of engine and temper. He stomped in without knocking, Anderson flapping after him. "Good news," Blair announced. "We've identified the mysterious woman in the shawl, Fiona Ross, sneaking back for more kissing." "That's not what the girl said," Hamish replied. Blair dismissed him with a wave. "I know suspects when I see them. You're blinded by loyalty." Hamish felt something twist in his gut. Maybe he was. Blair smirked as if he had won something. "You keep tripping over your own feet, Macbeth. One day it'll cost you your job." The sleet was coming down harder when Hamish finally left the station with lugs. They trudged toward the loch, the air sharp and wet. Hamish felt as if he had stepped over a line without meaning to. Protecting Donald, believing Fiona too quickly, misleading Strathbane. Lugs stopped, looked up at him, and gave a small whine. "Aye," Hamish muttered. "I've made a mess of it." He kept walking anyway. The line behind him did not move. Hamish knew he was in for trouble the moment he stepped through the front door of Tommel Castle. The weather had blown clear, but the air inside felt raw, as if someone had left every window open during an argument. Lugs pressed close to his leg, tail low. Somewhere in the castle a door slammed, which usually meant the Colonel was having one of his fits. Colonel Halberton Smythe appeared at the top of the stairs like an offended turkey, red-faced and fuming. "This is a disgraceful business, Macbeth. Disgraceful. London friends are already ringing to cancel bookings. Do you have any idea what that does to a hotel? Hamish stopped on the steps below him. I didn't push him down the bank, Colonel. The Colonel huffed. Your job is to keep things like this away from my establishment. Priscilla stood nearby, arms folded, face unreadable. She did not defend Hamish. She never did when her father was in a temper. She looked past Hamish as if searching for someone with less mud on their boots. Before Hamish could answer, Blair stormed in through the main door, trailing a smell of cheap aftershave strong enough to stun a sheep. Anderson scuttled behind him, carrying a notebook he would no doubt fill with nonsense. Right, Blair shouted, clapping his hands. Everyone in this place had better start talking. A pair of tourists jumped. A chambermaid nearly dropped a tray. Blair barreled through the public rooms, asking loud, crude questions about who kissed whom, who drank too much, and who would snap like a twig if provoked. Hamish watched with a sinking feeling. People lied when frightened, and Blair frightened everyone, even the furniture. The Colonel squawked in outrage. You cannot shout like that in a respectable hotel. Blair ignored him entirely. Anderson nodded at everything, as if Blair were giving a lecture on etiquette. Priscilla's gaze met Hamish's for half a second. It was cool, accusing, as if all of this was somehow his fault. He shifted, feeling suddenly aware of his outdated jacket and wet cuffs. He took himself off toward the quieter library before Blair could ruin anything else. The castle corridors felt too polished for his boots. He pushed open the library door and let Lugs in first. The dog went straight to the hearth, sniffed sharply, then sneezed. Hamish stepped over and crouched. The hearth was clean enough, but the stand beside it was wrong. One of the heavy brass pokers was missing. He straightened slowly. Mrs. McNeil, the housekeeper, had appeared in the doorway at some point without making a sound. She always moved like a ghost wearing sensible shoes. We sent it to be polished, she said stiffly. Hamish raised his eyebrows. Did you now? Aye. She didn't meet his eye. We run a proper house. He let it go because he didn't know what to make of it yet. But the lie, if it was a lie, hung in the air like damp laundry. Lugs whined again and pawed once at the hearthstone. Hamish hushed him and looked around the rest of the room. The windows were latched. One curtain had been tugged crooked, as if someone had grabbed it for balance. He made a mental note and left it at that. When he went back to the hall, Blair was cornering a waiter, demanding to know whether anyone was snogging in a suspicious manner. The waiter looked as if he wished to melt through the floor. Hamish escaped the castle before Blair could bark another order at him. The cold hit him like a slap as he walked back toward Lochdu, sleet crunching underfoot. Lugs trotted ahead, stopping now and then to check that Hamish hadn't vanished. Dr. Brodie was waiting for him outside the surgery, arms folded, expression stern. That man didn't just fall, he said without greeting. The head injury's wrong for it. There's a mark, a blow before he went over. Hamish let out a breath. You sure? As sure as I can be without reopening him. Something hard hit him first. Hamish thought of the missing poker, the weight of it, the feel of it in an angry hand. Brodie lowered his voice. You'll have Blair screeching if you tell him. He only wants simple answers. Hamish had learned that already. Blair refused to listen to anything that wasn't a jealous fiancé or an angry shove. Speak of the devil. Blair arrived at that very moment, face pink from exertion rather than shame. Anderson flapped behind him again like a weak echo. What's this nonsense? Blair barked. The man fell, hit his head on the way. End of story. Dr. Brodie gave Blair a look that could have curdled fresh milk. You can write your own stories, Inspector, but don't ask me to sign them. Blair puffed up. Stick to medicine. Hamish stepped between them before the doctor swung at him. Blair glared at Hamish as if he'd spoiled a good fight. Back in the village, gossip was swirling with even more enthusiasm than Blair. The Colonel's loud complaint that Hugh had argued over an unpaid bar bill was already making its way through Lochdu like a bad smell. People repeated it with relish, adding details that hadn't existed 10 minutes earlier. Hamish caught himself imagining the Colonel swinging that poker in a rage. The thought was unfair, but it stuck. He shook it off. Near the end of the afternoon, Priscilla approached him outside Patel's shop. He had not expected her to seek him out. She stopped a few feet away, as if afraid of catching whatever misfortune followed him. Do try not to ruin us, Hamish, she said quietly. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The remark stung more than Blair's insults ever had. Before he could think of a reply, she turned and walked back toward the castle, her steps brisk, her shoulders stiff. Hamish stood there in the raw cold, lugs pressed against his leg, and felt the unease settle into his bones like damp. Something in this case was wrong from start to finish, and he was now tangled in it more deeply than he meant to be. He stroked Lugs absently. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "We'll not solve it standing still." But even as he walked, the unease did not lift. The missing poker, the doctor's warning, the colonel's temper, Priscilla's distance, none of it fit neatly, and Hamish hated messes he couldn't name. The evening settled around Lochdu in a way he did not like at all. A thin fog had crept over Lochdu during the night and now sat stubbornly against the station windows, turning everything outside into a grey smear. Something was wrong the moment Hamish woke. Lugs refused his breakfast biscuit, which meant the dog felt the same uneasy pressure in the air that Hamish did. Even the stove spat instead of crackled. Hamish spent the morning pretending to read the circulars stacked on his desk. He hated paperwork, and they hated him back. Lugs lay by the stove, ears flicking every time a car went by, as if expecting Blair to burst in and accuse them both of murder. The telephone finally rang after noon. Hamish snatched it up before the second ring. Dr. Brodie did not waste time. "The Fuller report's in," he said briskly. "The injury was made before he hit the slope, and there's ash in it. Ash and soot. Something kept near a fire." Hamish felt the familiar drop in his stomach. The missing poker at the castle library flashed into his mind as clearly as if he still stood in front of the empty rack. "Could it be from the bank?" Hamish asked. "It could," Brodie said. "But it isn't." And he hung up, leaving no room for argument. Lugs whined, pacing. Hamish pulled on his coat and walked out, shrugging off the cold fog rolling down from the hills. The air tasted metallic. Something wanted to stay hidden. Tommel Castle rose ahead like a sulky giant. Mrs. McNeil answered his knock, her coat buttoned high, her expression even higher. "Back again?" she said. "Have you nothing better to do?" Hamish stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "The poker from the library. Where is it?" "I told you yesterday," she replied, stiff as frozen rope. "Sent to be polished." "You send many pokers away in the first week of January?" Hamish asked mildly. Mrs. McNeil's lips thinned. "We run a proper house, Mr. Macbeth. If something needs cleaning, I make sure it's done. I wouldn't forget it." Lugs sniffed the hem of her coat and sneezed. Hamish caught the smell then. Peat smoke. Stronger than any other in the castle. Even stronger than the library hearth had been. She stepped back as if he'd accused her aloud. "Mind your dog," she snapped. "There's nothing here for him." "Seems interested anyway," Hamish said. But he let it go. She would only dig her heels in deeper if pressed. Outside, the fog had thickened. It hugged the ground like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. By mid-afternoon, word reached Hamish that Donald had been released from Strathbane. Released, but not cleared. Blair was in the bar at the Lochdu Hotel boasting loudly that it was only a matter of time before Donald cracked. The villagers drank up every word. Hamish pushed open the bar door. The room fell quiet for a moment, then roared back into chatter. Not polite chatter, mean chatter. "He'll never get bookings again," someone muttered. "Fiona should pack her bags," another hissed. "She's the shame of the village now." Hamish knew better than to interrupt gossip in full swing. It only made them lie more carefully next time. Still, the cold way people turned their shoulders as he passed unsettled him. They blamed him as much as Blair. He was meant to keep scandal neat and tucked away, not let it spread like mould. He had barely reached the station again when the telephone rang. Daviot this time, sounding as if he clutched his chest with one hand and his reputation with the other. "Macbeth, you must steady the ship," Daviot said. "We cannot have the tourist trade damaged by your Highland insistence on drama." Hamish looked at the fog outside the window. "The drama started when a man landed dead at the loch," he said. "Not with me." Daviot gave a nervous laugh that carried no warmth. "Yes, well, do try to tidy it, quickly." Then he hung up as if terrified Hamish might argue. Hamish raked a hand through his hair. The village wanted him to solve things quietly. Strathbane wanted him to solve things quickly. The castle wanted him to solve things invisibly. No one wanted the truth if it cost them anything. On the way back to his cottage, he crossed paths with Angus MacDonald, who waved him over with too much eagerness. Angus was never eager unless he smelled gossip ripe enough to eat. "Hamish," he said, lowering his voice, "you'll want to hear this. I saw the Englishman, Hugh, arguing fierce with the colonel not long after midnight. by the fire, looked ready to swing at each other. Hamish tensed. "You sure?" "As sure as I am that the minister's hair's fake." Angus grinned, pleased with himself. The Colonel, with his temper and his pride. The Colonel, who had ranted at Hamish earlier. The Colonel, who had every cause to hate unwanted headlines. And the poker, the blow, the ash. Hamish almost let the idea settle, almost let himself believe the neatness of it. A laird in a rage, a blow by the hearth. But something was off. Angus always embellished. And the smell on Mrs. McNeil's coat hadn't been ordinary hearth smoke. It had been thick peat, the sort that clung to fabric, hair, everything. Lugs whined again, as if disliking the path Hamish's thoughts were wandering. The fog rolled heavier as Hamish finally walked toward home. It blurred the village lights, blurred the loch, blurred everything except the uncomfortable feeling tightening in his chest. Town whispered one thing. Castle whispered another. Lochdu itself whispered more lies than truth. He felt nudged, pushed even, toward the wrong answer. And that meant the right one was still hiding somewhere in the smoke. Low cloud had rolled in during the night and settled over Lochdu like a wet towel. By morning everything felt damp, heavy and wrong. Even Hamish's kettle refused to boil properly, sputtering as if protesting the weather. Lugs paced in front of the door, ears twitching at sounds Hamish couldn't hear. Something was brewing, and not the tea. The Kirk Hall smelled faintly of mildew and hymn books when Hamish opened it for the meeting. He had hoped for cooperation, though he should have known better. Villagers preferred gossip to statements. By the time people drifted in, slowly, reluctantly, Hamish already felt the tightness in the air. Fiona and Donald sat at the back, both looking as if they'd been dragged through a hedge. Donald stared at the floor. Fiona stared at nothing at all. Nessie Curry, of course, put herself right in front, as if she planned to speak for the whole village whether they liked it or not. Jessie sat beside her, ready to pinch her sister when required. Hamish cleared his throat. "Did anyone see Hugh after he left the ballroom?" No one answered. A crofter in a patched coat finally muttered, "Aye, but we're not putting our names to it." Hamish blinked. "Why not?" "We've bookings to think of," the man said, avoiding Hamish's face. "Journalists love a statement. They twist things. Tourism dies, simple as that." "A man died," Hamish reminded them. His voice sounded flatter than he meant it to. Mr. Patel stepped forward, hands folded in front of him as if in prayer. "Constable, I've children to feed. I can't risk being quoted in papers. My brother in Glasgow reads every headline. He'd phone me 6 times a day." Hamish stared at him. "I'm asking for the truth, not a confession." But Patel shook his head. "Truth gets people in trouble." The minister rose next, smoothing his cassock. "Macbeth," he said in that mild voice ministers used when they didn't want to answer anything directly. "Sometimes a community must choose forgiveness over details. We should pray for healing rather than dredge up every harsh fact." Hamish felt his jaw tighten. "The killer not needing healing, then?" The minister gave a pained smile, the sort that avoided all responsibility. Nessie Curry clasped her hands and said brightly, "Well, I'm sure it will all sort out, Hamish. You always get there in the end." "Aye," Jessie added, "usually." It was meant as reassurance. It sounded like criticism. Hamish looked around the room. Half-truths and tight lips stared back. He felt that old, familiar frustration, the kind that came whenever he realized the villagers liked him well enough, so long as liking him didn't cost them anything. He ended the meeting early. There was no point flogging a dead horse, especially when the horse was hiding behind hymnals. Outside, drizzle soaked into his collar. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish decided to try Fiona again. The guest house was cold, as if the fire hadn't been lit properly. Fiona sat at the tiny kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "Hugh wasn't just here for the party," she said without waiting to be asked. "He was poking into figures for his firm, looking at how profitable the castle really was." Hamish frowned. "Why would he tell you that?" "He didn't," she said quietly. "I saw the papers in his briefcase. Numbers, staff lists, debts. He said some folk round here wouldn't like daylight." She wouldn't look at him. That bothered him more than the words. "Which folk?" he asked. She shook her head. "I'm not saying. You'd only pull them in, and we've enough trouble." Hamish wanted to snap that murder counted as trouble too, but he didn't. He watched her for a moment longer. She had that stubborn set to her shoulders that meant she wouldn't say another word. He left it. He left too many things these days. Back in the village, he stepped into Patel's shop for a loaf. A half-finished ledger lay open on the counter next to the tins of peas. Patel closed it too quickly. "Sorting stock," Patel said. "Very normal, nothing strange." Hamish hadn't asked a thing, which made the answer stranger. He lifted an eyebrow. "I?" "Yes," Patel said, too fast, and handed him the loaf as if it might burn the counter. Hamish took it without comment. He wasn't sure whether Patel had something to hide or was just terrified of the idea of being questioned again. The man's nerves made him look guilty, even if he'd only miscounted boxes of cereal. The telephone was ringing in the station when Hamish returned. Lugs beat him to the door, barking once. Daviot's voice met Hamish like a cold slap. "Macbeth, you must stop agitating the populace," Daviot said. "I've had 2 calls from business owners. You're unsettling them." Hamish pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'm asking folk to tell me what they saw. That's my job." "Yes, but do it quietly, and without upsetting anyone." Hamish let out a dry laugh. "A man's dead, sir." Yes, tragic," Daviot said, in the same tone one used to discuss a broken vase. "But focus on maintaining order, no more meetings." Hamish hung up before he said something that would land him in Strathbane himself. Outside, the drizzle thinned, but the air inside the station felt heavier than before. Lugs paced in front of the door, tail down as if waiting for a knock that hadn't come yet. Hamish sank into his chair and stared at the fogged window. Town didn't want noise. The castle didn't want scandal. The village didn't want responsibility. All of them wanted silence. And silence was the one thing that let killers walk free. 2 days after the first meeting, after the gossip had only thickened and the silence had grown teeth, Hamish should have known the afternoon was doomed when the Kirkhall key stuck again. He jiggled it, swore under his breath, and Lugs barked at the door as if the lock were personally insulting them. They had already tried a sensible meeting once, and it had produced nothing but piety and panic. This time Hamish had come back for a sharper thing altogether, a quick reconstruction, however foolish it looked on paper. Folk drifted in, grumbling. They had been at the castle on Hogmanay, and Hamish hoped seeing each other in the same space might shake something loose. Instead, they stood about as if at a dull funeral. Even Priscilla came, though she kept near the door, arms folded as if she regretted stepping inside. Blair, of course, had sent Anderson to observe, which meant to get under everyone's feet. "All right," Hamish said, clapping his hands once. "We're going to try a wee reconstruction. Just stand where you remember being when the lights went out at the castle." It was a mistake the moment he said it. People shuffled around vaguely, placing themselves in spots that made no sense. Nessie put herself almost in the centre, claiming she'd had a grand view. Jessie rolled her eyes so hard Hamish worried she'd injure herself. Lugs lay by the door, ears flat. Even he could sense the trouble coming. Hamish switched off the hall lights. The blackout was instant and complete. In the darkness he began counting, copying the band's countdown from that night. 10, 9, 8. A thud sounded somewhere to his left. Someone gasped. Someone else tripped. 7. Would you watch your elbows? That was Jessie. 6. Oh, heavens above, who is grabbing me? That was Nessie. 5. Move, you great lump. That was Anderson, apparently stepping on someone's foot. A chair clattered over. Lugs barked twice, agitated. Hamish flicked the lights back on. Chaos. Chairs skewed. People glaring. Nessie hopping on one foot. Anderson red-faced and looking as if he wished he'd stayed in Strathbane. But the worst sight by far was the one right beside Hamish. Priscilla, whom he had grabbed by the elbow to stop her slipping on the uneven boards. The picture must have been something. Hamish Macbeth, lanky and awkward, holding the elegant hotelier's daughter as if in a ramshackle waltz. A ripple of laughter spread through the hall. Hamish released her as if he'd touched a hot stove. Priscilla drew back, cool as snow. "If you're quite finished, Hamish," she said, voice clipped. Laughter grew louder. Someone snorted. Someone else whispered something about always fancied himself. Hamish felt heat crawl up his neck. He wished the floorboards would split open and swallow him, hymn books and all. And Nessie, sensing blood like a cheerful shark, pounced. "Speaking of Hogmanay kisses," she announced in a voice meant for the back pews, "remember that year Hamish was found behind the hall kissing the wrong girl?" "Oh, the gossip then," the villagers roared. Even Jessie cracked a smile. Hamish stared at the hall ceiling, wondering if God himself might put him out of his misery. He tried to salvage things. Did anyone notice anything strange that night? A shawl, Nessie said promptly, warming to her performance. Dark shawl thrown over the banister near the ballroom, but it was gone by the time folk found the body. Never saw who left it. Hamish opened his mouth to ask more, but Jessie cut in. Could have been that mysterious woman we all saw. We didn't all see her, Hamish said. Aye, we did, Nessie insisted. Tallish, dark clothes, nobody knowing her name, very suspicious. She had invented the woman in the space of 10 seconds, but several villagers nodded as if they now remembered her too. Given another hour, they'd give the imaginary suspect a favourite drink and a motive. Hamish realised the reconstruction had turned into a farce. Worse, he had handed Blair a fresh story to mock him with, and given the villagers a new tale to add to their collection of Macbeth embarrassments. He ended the exercise abruptly. Right, that's enough. Thank you all for coming. They did not leave quickly enough. More chuckles, more whispers followed him out the door. Lugs trotted beside him, sympathetic but unhelpful. Outside, the drizzle had returned, thin and cold. Hamish stood there, staring at the grey street of Lochdu, feeling the humiliation settle on him like damp wool. What he'd hoped would bring clarity had only brought chaos. And laughter. Always laughter. Fool, he muttered. He wasn't sure whether he meant himself, the villagers, or the whole case. But something in Nessie's remark, the shawl, remained niggling at him. A small thread in the mess. Not enough to pull yet. He tugged his coat tighter and set off down the road, Lugs keeping close. Nothing was clearer now, but everything felt more tangled. Hamish knew something was wrong the moment he saw the station door hanging open. Lugs halted on the path, ears stiff, giving a low, uneasy growl. Hamish rubbed the dog's head, though his own stomach had already tightened. Only one man in Strathbane left doors open as a warning instead of an accident. Blair was waiting inside, seated in Hamish's own chair, smelling of cheap tobacco and the smugness he wore like an old coat. Anderson hovered nearby, scribbling on a pad so furiously he might set it alight. Well now, Blair said, drawing out the words. Your wee play acting in the Kirk Hall didna help much, Macbeth. Hamish hung up his coat slowly. It was worth a try. Aye, Blair said, leaning back, hands clasped over his belly. Except we've got what we need now. Hamish paused. Who's we? Blair's grin widened. Fiona Ross is at Strathbane. Brought her in this morning. Should have done it days ago, but you were too busy playing village theatre. A dull thump filled Hamish's ears. Lugs whined softly and pushed against his leg. Hamish kept his voice steady. What have you dragged her in for? You'll see. Blair slapped the table as if calling for another pint. Come along then. Try not to make a fool of yourself again. At Strathbane the air felt colder, the walls greyer, and the corridors smelled of disinfectant and fear. Fiona sat at the interview table, pale but upright, her back straight in that stubborn way she had when she refused to crumble. Anderson fluttered around her, dropping a pen twice, unable to decide where to stand. Blair leaned over the table like a butcher examining a cut of meat. So, Miss Ross, we've been thinking, women who can kiss one man in front of another can do anything, eh? Fiona's chin lifted, though her hands tightened in her lap. I told you. He grabbed me. I pushed him off. Blair slid a bank statement across the table with a flourish. Funny, then, how you've a tidy wee cash deposit last week. This looks a lot like payment for keeping your mouth shut. Fiona stared at the paper. It was an advance from the Colonel, for overtime. Hamish said nothing. He watched her face instead. She wasn't good at lying, but that didn't mean she wasn't telling the truth. Blair snorted. Aye, let's ring the Colonel then. The call was placed on speaker. Colonel Halberton Smythe answered in confusion, mumbling about invoices, accounts, and a great deal on my mind, Inspector. He didn't deny the payment, but he didn't confirm it either. No help at all. Hamish felt something shift in his chest. His earlier certainty about Fiona slipped. Not gone, but unsteady, like wet ground beneath a boot. When Blair stepped out to shout at a constable, Hamish sat opposite Fiona. You should have told me, he said quietly. Her eyes flashed. I didn't think my bank account was police business. Aye, well, Hamish muttered. He didn't finish the sentence. The gap between them was already widening. Blair swept back in. That'll do. She's not confessing today, but she will. He smirked at Hamish. Folks say you always take the side of pretty women, Macbeth. Good thing I'm here to keep order. Hamish clenched his jaw. If he answered, the words would be the wrong ones. By late afternoon, they returned to Lochdu, where Blair headed straight for the pub. Hamish didn't want to follow, but he had to hear what was bubbling. Lugs padded behind him, uneasy. Inside the bar, Blair held court like a cheap king. As good as charged, he announced loudly. Fiona Ross, mark my words, money changing hands, lies changing stories, easy case. Villagers murmured, some with relief, some with mean excitement. Hamish caught a few sideways glances in his direction. Aye, someone whispered too loudly. Macbeth always backs the ladies. Lets the real villains stroll off. He's blinded, another muttered. Always was. Hamish stood there, feeling every word land. He wasn't surprised. Lochdu turned fast when the wind shifted. And it was shifting now, against Fiona, and against him too. The worst part was the weight in his chest. Not anger, not even embarrassment. Just the creeping suspicion that he might indeed have backed the wrong person. But something didn't fit. Blair's easy certainty, the Colonel's vague answers, the unexplained cash, the shawl Nessie had mentioned, too many loose threads. Hamish left the pub without a word. Lugs followed close, ears pinned. Outside, night had crept in early, and the damp cold held the village in a strange stillness. Hamish stood on the quiet street of Lochdu, uncertain for the first time in days which direction the truth truly lay. The wind was wrong the moment Hamish stepped outside. It came hard off the loch, sharp enough to sting his cheeks, driving showers sideways and rattling the loose sign over Patel's shop so violently it sounded like a bell tolling for trouble. Lugs pressed close to his leg, unhappy. Even the dog knew the village was turning sour. Hamish had barely reached the station gate when Mr. McIver the crofter strode up, face like a slapped haddock. "You'll be pleased, constable," he barked. "Tommel Castle's had 3 cancellations this morning. Weddings, conferences, gone. Folk dinna want to book a place you've turned into a murder circus." "I didna turn anything," Hamish said. "A man died. That's the fact of it." "You could have let Blair call it an accident," McIver snapped. "Would have saved us all grief." Hamish looked at him. "Aye, and left a killer to try again." McIver scowled as if logic were a personal insult and stomped off into the wind. Lugs growled low as if tempted to chase him. Inside the shop, Patel's usual cheer was gone. He was hunched behind the counter with a stack of invoices that looked more battered than he did. "Constable," he said without greeting, "do you know how many telephone calls I've had today? People asking if this is now the murder village. Murder village. They laugh. Then they say they'll stay in Ullapool instead." Hamish winced. "Folk forget quick." "They forget after the summer," Patel said darkly. "Not in winter. Winter gossip sticks." He shuffled the invoices, then added in a softer, guiltier voice, "I didn't ask for this trouble, Hamish." "Nor did I," Hamish said, but Patel didn't seem to hear. Outside, a group of crofters were waiting, hands shoved into jackets, shoulders hunched, expressions grim. The wind tugged at their caps like it wanted to snatch them off. As Hamish approached, the men closed around him in a half-circle, not threatening, but not friendly either. One stepped forward, a wiry fellow with a broken nose that looked recently rebroken. "Constable, we're losing business," he said. "The castle promised extra winter work. Now they're cancelling. This whole mess, if you'd just let it lie as an accident, we'd all be better off." Hamish stood straighter. "A man's dead. You're not better off with a killer coming back for more." Muttered disapproval spread like rain on a tin roof. "Aye, well," the wiry man grunted, "if another man dies, it'll be your fault too." Hamish opened his mouth, but they were already turning away, drifting off into the misty rain like a flock of offended sheep. Lugs let out a soft whimper. He could feel the shift in the village better than any human. By midday, Hamish had earned more cold shoulders than he had in the previous year combined. Miss Henderson from the post office, who normally chatted endlessly about stamps, turned abruptly to rearrange envelopes when he walked in. A pair of tourists stepped out of his way with suspicious glances. Even Patel's wife, usually warm as summer, avoided his eyes when he passed. But Fiona and Donald were suffering worse. Hamish found Donald outside his guest house, wrestling with a broken gutter as if the metal itself had insulted him. "Hammer's rusted," Donald muttered without looking over. "Everything's rusted now." Hamish tried gently. "Folk will calm down." "That right?" Donald's laugh was ugly and small. Yesterday a woman told her bear not to touch the gate because a murderer lived there. That what you call calm?" Hamish had no answer. Donald returned to the gutter, hitting it with a little too much enthusiasm. Lugs flinched at the noise. At the shop later, Hamish saw Fiona. She was buying a loaf of bread, and 3 villagers stared at her as if she were covered in plague marks. When she turned, her face was stiff, eyes hollow, and she walked out without a word. That evening, Hamish spotted chalk marks on Donald's gate. "Killer" scrawled in childish letters. The rain had not washed it off yet. He looked around. Curtains twitched. No one opened a door. No one came to apologize. Hamish fetched a bucket and scrubbed the word away himself. The chalk smeared into pale streaks, stubborn and ugly. His hands grew numb with cold. Lugs paced beside him, restless, sensing the sourness in the air. When he finished, he stood a long moment staring at the gate, feeling angry with the village, angry with the case, and angry with himself. A better policeman, one with a fancy degree and sharp suits, would have solved it by now. Loch Dhu would not be turning on its own. As he walked back toward the station, an old crofter hailed him from a gate. The man was one of those ancient types who looked as if he had been carved from driftwood and peat smoke. "Macbeth," he croaked. "Something he ought to know. That Englishman, Hugh, he came round my land earlier in the week, asking about a right of way down to the loch. Said some folk want the path blocked." Hamish stopped. "Blocked? Who'd want that?" "Folk with land," the crofter muttered. "Folk who like privacy. Folk who don't like questions. I told him the path's been open since before the kirk was built, but he didna like that answer." "Did he mention who he was asking for?" Hamish pressed. "Nay," the crofter said, "but he was writing things down. I dinna care for men who write things down." He shut his gate with a bang, leaving Hamish alone with the wind. On the way back into the village, Hamish passed 2 men gossiping by the loch path. "Aye, right of way. Big land deal brewing, I heard." "Half the village argues about fences every year. Bet it's one of them." "Or the colonel. He'd block anything that inconveniences him." "Or Patel. He's always up to something with money." Hamish walked faster. The gossip had already mutated into 8 different theories, none useful, but one thing caught his mind. Hugh walking boundaries with a notebook. That wasn't a drunken party-goer. That was a man with a purpose. Back at the station, the wind rattled the window frames hard enough to make Lugs jump. Hamish sat by the stove, rubbing the dog's ears. Lugs leaned into him but kept glancing at the door, uneasy. He understood. The social strain was now heavier than the weather. The village was turning against him. The castle was turning against him. Strathbane had never been on his side to begin with, and somewhere in the middle of it all, he felt himself slipping, backing the wrong people, missing the right signs, stumbling around like a fool while gossip hardened into fact. He leaned back in the creaking chair, staring at the dim light from the single street lamp outside. Nothing about the case was clear, and the clearer it became that Loch Dhu wanted him to stop asking questions, the more certain he felt that he couldn't. Not now, not with things turning ugly. The next step would be worse, and he could feel it coming, like weather rolling in off the hills. Hamish knew something was off at the castle before he even reached the back steps. Lugs stopped short on the gravel, ears pitched forward, tail low. The service entrance, usually clattering with pans and gossip, was too quiet. Even the wind, which had been snapping at the loch earlier, seemed to hold its breath near the castle walls. Hamish slipped inside. He wasn't proud of creeping about like a poacher, but pride did not solve murders. The corridor smelled faintly of cabbage and polish. He moved carefully, boots silent on the worn linoleum, until he heard voices ahead, low, sharp, and unhappy. Cash flow, no choice. Selling out to a chain. That was the colonel, sounding more flustered than furious. Another voice, smoother and clipped, the family solicitor. And that damned English accountant should never have been told anything. Hamish edged closer to the half-open door of a small sitting room. The fire inside crackled. He heard papers rustling, the colonel's heavy sighs. Then Priscilla's voice came from behind him. "You've taken to eavesdropping now?" Hamish straightened so fast he nearly tripped. "If you folk had told me the truth to begin with, I wouldn't have need to." Her expression barely shifted, but the air tightened between them. Her voice was cool as iced water. "This is private business." "Aye, and private business has a way of becoming murder when nobody talks," Hamish said. It came out sharper than he intended. From inside the sitting room came another huff from the colonel. "Macbeth again. For heaven's sake, Priscilla. Get rid of him." Priscilla stepped past Hamish and eased the door mostly shut, as if shielding the family's embarrassment. She turned back, arms folded. "The castle has been in talks with a hotel chain. You might as well hear it plainly." Hamish waited. "Hugh worked for them," she continued. "His visit wasn't just social. He was here to assess whether Tommel Castle was worth buying. My father hated the idea. Some of the staff were eager about redundancy packages. Others feared losing their jobs." Hamish blinked. "So half the castle had motive to dislike him." "Motive to dislike," she repeated, "not motive to kill." "That depends on what he found," Hamish said, letting his voice drift toward the half-closed door. The solicitor's voice leaked through again. The New Year publicity photographs would have helped. A lively crowd, festive shots, now ruined. At that, Hamish's ears pricked. "Photographs?" Priscilla shook her head, almost weary. "A magazine spread, advertorial nonsense, nothing to do with any of this." Hamish wasn't convinced. People lied easiest about things that embarrassed them rather than incriminated them, and Priscilla's tone carried the brittle edge of someone holding back more than she wanted to admit. "You could have told me from the start," Hamish said. "My father didn't want rumours," she replied. "He still doesn't. You leaking our affairs through that village of yours won't help." "It's not my village that's the problem," Hamish snapped. "Your English accountant ended up dead at the loch." Her eyes hardened slightly. "And you think we pushed him? That we lured him into some corridor and bludgeoned him because he gave us a poor financial rating? You sound ridiculous." Hamish looked away. Maybe he did. But the Colonel's temper, the missing poker, the castle's money trouble, it all sat too neatly, too comfortably. "You think my father did it?" Priscilla said. Not a question. Hamish didn't answer, which was answer enough. "He was arguing with Hugh," Hamish muttered finally. "Folk saw, and if Hugh threatened the sale—" "It was not a threat," Priscilla said sharply. "It was a negotiation. Poorly handled, yes, but negotiations aren't murder." Hamish wasn't sure of anything anymore. His own resentment toward the Colonel, years of being spoken down to, dismissed, treated as a nuisance, was colouring his thoughts. He knew it. And yet he couldn't stop imagining the old man swinging a poker in drunken outrage. "Go back to your village, Hamish," Priscilla said quietly. "This is not your world." Her calm dismissal stung more than Blair's worst insults. She moved past him, returning to the muffled argument behind the door, shutting him out with a simple turn of her shoulder. Hamish stood in the corridor a moment longer, listening to the muffled tones of people who might all have good reasons to lie. Luggs trotted up beside him, nudging his hand. "Aye, boy," Hamish murmured. "We're not wanted here." He slipped back out the service entrance, the cold air of Loch Dhu hitting him like a rebuke. The castle loomed behind him, full of money troubles, sharp tempers, and secrets he hadn't even begun to untangle. Something there was rotten, perhaps many things, and Hamish was beginning to realise he was not just chasing a killer, he was stumbling into a world that would rather crush him than tell him the truth. Hamish knew he was starting the day wrong when the station telephone began ringing before he had even unlocked the front door. Luggs gave a sharp bark, as if warning him not to answer. Hamish ignored the advice and picked up the receiver. It was Blair, already in a foul mood. "Well, have you got anything worth hearing yet, Macbeth? Or are you still faffing about with shawls and shadows?" Hamish hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Then he said the thing he had been brooding on since leaving the castle. "The Colonel argued with Hugh, about money, about the sale. The old man's temper's worse than folk say." A greedy silence spread down the line. Then Blair let out a satisfied grunt. "Now that is worth my time. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Try not to ruin the place before I arrive." The line went dead. Hamish set the receiver down, instantly regretting the impulse. Luggs whined at him, picking up the tension. "Aye," Hamish muttered. "I ken. I'm an idiot." But it was too late. Blair arrived with Anderson clinging behind him like a frightened spaniel, and together they thundered up the castle drive as if they owned it. Tommel Castle's drawing room had been chosen for the interview, stuffy, over-warm, and full of stern ancestors in oil paint. The Colonel had been fetched from his study, red-faced and sputtering. Priscilla stood by the window, arms crossed, looking as if she wished someone would set the whole room on fire so she could leave. Blair strode in like a conqueror. "Right, Colonel Halberton Smythe. We hear ye had a right barney with the deceased." The colonel puffed up, moustache quivering. "I was discussing figures. A straightforward conversation." "Aye," Blair said, leaning close. "And when ye dinna get the numbers you want, do ye hit folk, or shove them doon lockbanks?" The colonel sputtered. "How dare you? I was 3 sheets to the wind by midnight. Ask anyone. I could barely stand." Hamish sat glumly in a corner, feeling the weight of his mistake. Priscilla turned her head slightly. "It's true," she said with curt precision. "My father was drunk. Quite hopeless." "Hopelessly innocent," the colonel snapped. "Ridiculous accusation." Blair lumbered around the room, peering at trophies and photographs as if the walls themselves would confess. Anderson scribbled vigorously, though the pen repeatedly squeaked and left no ink at all. "So ye argued," Blair pressed. "I told him he was wrong about the numbers," the colonel huffed. "He said the place wasn't worth the asking price. I told him he could go to the devil, that's all." "No threats?" Blair asked. "Threats? The man threatened me," the colonel retorted. "Said he'd show the chain every weakness we had. Insolent fellow." Hamish winced. He had handed Blair a theory on a platter, and now it was collapsing in front of him. Soon Blair would— "You see, Macbeth," Blair said loudly the moment they stepped into the corridor. "You dinna even know your own betters. Waste of my time, hauling myself up here." There it was. Hamish felt the sting more sharply than he expected. What hurt wasn't Blair's sneer. Blair sneered at everything. But the truth in it. He had pushed suspicion without evidence out of irritation and old slights, and he had nothing to show for it. Priscilla appeared behind them. "Finished?" she asked coolly. "Aye," Hamish said, not meeting her eyes. The colonel, still muttering, followed them out. Just as he reached the top of the stairs, he said offhandedly, "I did hear someone crying, you know, in the service corridor near the library, just after midnight. I assumed it was one of the maids having sentimental troubles." Hamish stopped. "Crying?" Yes, the colonel said impatiently. "Soft weeping. Could have been the Ross girl, I suppose. She was making an unholy mess of everything." Priscilla gave her father a warning look, but he had already stomped off. Hamish filed the detail away. Crying near the library. After midnight. Everyone would assume Fiona. Even he felt the quick pull of that explanation. Too quick. He headed down the front steps, Lugs trotting beside him. The wind had eased, but the air around the castle still felt wrong, as if it held its breath. Near the gravel turn, Lugs suddenly veered left, nose low, pulling Hamish toward a side entrance. It was a small service door, half hidden by an overgrown shrub. Hamish tugged it open. Peat ash dusted the stone threshold. Dark flecks, fresh enough not to have scattered. "Odd place for ash," Hamish murmured. "Unless someone was dragging something, or someone, this way." Lugs sniffed the ash, then whined softly. Hamish straightened, rubbing his neck. He had come here to accuse the wrong man. He had let Blair enjoy himself at his expense. And he had walked straight past a clue that was sitting in plain sight. Too many mistakes, too many assumptions. He felt the case slipping each time he grabbed at the wrong thread. "Come on, boy," he said quietly. But even as he turned back toward the village, the unease stayed with him. Ash on a doorway, crying in a corridor, and his own foolish certainty clouding everything. Hamish realized something was wrong the moment he opened the station ledger and saw the castle rota staring back at him like an accusation. He had ignored it for days. Now every neat line of Mrs. McNeil's tidy handwriting seemed to point its finger at him, asking why he had been so daft. Lugs lay under the desk, low growl in his throat, as if he too had had enough of wrong turns. "Aye, I ken," Hamish muttered. "Should have looked at this sooner." The rota placed Mrs. McNeil in 3 places at once, near the library at 11:30, near the staff stairs just before midnight, and in the kitchens when the actual countdown happened. No one had questioned her. No one ever did. She glided about like a ghost, managing the castle with the righteousness of someone who believed chaos would kill her on the spot. He shut the ledger and stood abruptly. Something in him hardened. Not confidence, he didn't get much of that, but a kind of weary determination. He walked up to Tommel Castle by the service path, Lugs trotting at his heel. A damp drizzle clung to his coat, but he ignored it. Mrs. McNeil's room was under the eaves at the back of the top floor, the sort of place no Halbert and Smythe would ever climb to. Hamish knocked. The door opened exactly the width her shoulders allowed, nothing more. The peat-thick air rolled out at him, choking and unmistakable. Lugs backed up at once, ears flattening. "Oh, it's yourself," Mrs. McNeil said, voice clipped. "I'm busy, Mr. Macbeth. There's linens to sort." Hamish stepped inside before she could block him. The room was spotless, suffocatingly tidy. A small old stove in the corner glowed low, filling the air with the same smoke he had smelled at the loch path and on the library flagstones. His eyes went to a peg by the door. A dark shawl hung there, heavy, woven, exactly the sort Nessie had screeched about during his disastrous reconstruction. Mrs. McNeil reached past him in a flash and snatched it off the peg. "My Sunday shawl," she said sharply. "No concern of yours." Hamish looked at it, a frayed thread at the hem, a smear of something dark on the fringe. Could be dirt, could be anything. He didn't touch it. "I was checking some things," Hamish said mildly. "Just the usual." "The usual is you upsetting folk who've done nothing wrong." She folded the shawl tightly, fingers whitening. "And I've worked here 27 years without any policeman sticking his nose in my drawers." He let the remark pass. "Where were you at midnight, Mrs. McNeil?" "In the kitchens, checking the tea urns." The answer came too fast. "Funny," Hamish murmured. "Your own rota says you were in the staff corridor then, making sure the band had their sandwiches." Her mouth pinched. A crack, the first one, ran through her polished composure. Luggs gave a low, uneasy growl. Not accusing, Luggs never accused, but responding to something off in the woman's voice. Mrs. McNeil dropped her gaze. "Rota's a guide," she said stiffly. "Folk change things. I change things." Hamish studied her without blinking. "Aye. Maybe too much this time." Her chin jerked up. "Are you calling me a liar?" Hamish didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. He left her room before she could order him out. On the stair he paused, hand on the banister. There was a faint dusting of ash on the carpet runner, fine black flecks easily missed. Luggs sniffed and sneezed. Downstairs in the dim service corridor, Hamish found the housemaids huddled like hens before a storm. They stiffened when he approached. "Morning," he said. None of them greeted him back. "Did any of you see Mrs. McNeil around midnight?" he asked. The maids traded glances. The youngest one opened her mouth, but an older maid nudged her sharply and stepped forward. "We keep to our duties," she said. "Mrs. McNeil tells us what needs doing. We don't question her." That wasn't my question. She looked past him, at the wall, at anything that wasn't his face. "You'll need to speak to herself. We can't be dragged into trouble." Dragged into trouble. A familiar, nasty phrase. Loch Dhu had its own version of it, repeated whenever villagers wanted to protect themselves by letting someone else sink. He returned to the station, unsettled. The phone rang just as he hung up his coat. A Glasgow voice answered his request for information. "Aye, I remember her," the man said. "Housekeeper type. Worked at a firm Hugh Latimer had dealings with. Auditing work years ago. Money went missing. No charges, mind. But the place folded. Folk were angry. Not all of them were innocent." Hamish felt the shift in his stomach. Cold, reluctant. He put the receiver down. Luggs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Later that afternoon he walked back up to the castle, this time with purpose. Mrs. McNeil was in the downstairs corridor, polishing a brass dish with unnecessary ferocity. "I've another question," Hamish said quietly. "I've no more answers." "Aye, but you should hear it anyway. Hugh Latimer worked at the firm you were with in Glasgow, years ago, before it shut." Her hand froze, the cloth dropped. "That has nothing to do with this," she whispered. "Maybe, maybe not." She straightened, spine stiff. "If you're accusing me, say it." Hamish shook his head. "Not yet." Her jaw trembled, only once barely noticeable. Then she forced a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was in the kitchens at midnight. You'll find no proof otherwise." He looked at her, long and tired. "I'll find what I find." She turned away, shoulders rigid. Outside, Luggs trotted ahead, pausing at the side path that led toward the loch. The dog whined softly, remembering what Hamish remembered. The same smoke, the same ash, the same cold trail. Hamish stood in the dull light, rain threatening again, stomach knotted. For the first time, the pieces arranged themselves without slipping apart. But even now, he couldn't trust it, not fully. "Come on, boy," he said. Yet he stayed where he was for a long moment, the quiet pressing in on him. Something was moving beneath the surface of this case, old and sour, and he was only just touching it. Hamish knew it was going wrong the moment Blair folded his arms across his great belly and smirked. The station office felt cramped with the pair of them in it, Blair blocking the door like an overfed watchdog, and Daviot already sighing down the telephone as if the whole murder case were a personal inconvenience visited on him by the Highlands. "I'm telling you," Hamish said, keeping his voice level, "the poker might still show something. It was used before the fall. Dr. Brodie said—" "We are not," Daviot interrupted, voice thin and tight, "spending another penny on forensics for a lump of metal someone's probably polished to death already. We need closure, Macbeth. Closure." "Aye," Blair drawled. "And we need you to stop sniffing round we women who've worked honest jobs while you chase fairy stories." Hamish felt heat climb the back of his neck. Blair saw it and grinned wider. Lugs under the desk let out a warning grumble. Hamish forced himself still. "You dinna think a housekeeper could lift a poker?" "I dinna think you could lift a case if I handed it to you wrapped in ribbon," Blair said. "Now stop wasting the station's time." Hamish gave up on them. They weren't going to help, not unless someone handed them a confession engraved on stone. Fine. If official channels were shut, he would try another way. The Kirk Hall felt colder than any winter outside. The minister had tried to warm the place with 2 tired heaters shoved under the front pew, but they gave off little more than a faint metallic hum. The villagers arrived in tight groups, coats buttoned to their chins, eyes bright with curiosity and suspicion. They took their seats as if attending a funeral they hoped wouldn't mention them by name. Hamish stood near the pulpit, wishing the whole idea of a reconciliation meeting hadn't sounded so reasonable when he said it aloud to himself that morning. He'd asked Mrs. McNeil to attend as a respected figure. Now he watched her sit straight-backed in the 3rd row, shawl folded neatly in her lap, mouth set like a metal clasp. Donald and Fiona slipped in last. People shuffled away from them, politely pretending it was about space on the bench. The minister cleared his throat. "We are gathered," he began, "to—" Hamish cut him off. "We're gathered because a man died, and there's been more lies about it than hymns sung in this place all winter." The minister blinked, offended. Mrs. McNeil drew herself up. A ripple of unease went through the hall. Hamish pressed on. "Folk have kept quiet about things they saw. Folk have protected people they shouldn't. There was a shawl left on a banister at Hogmanay, a poker gone missing, a past job in Glasgow no one mentioned, and someone walking the service corridors at times that dinna match what's written." He didn't look directly at Mrs. McNeil yet, but he felt her stiffen like a board. Nessie Curry gasped loudly, enjoying herself far too much. "I told you I saw a shawl," she whispered fiercely to her neighbour. Mrs. McNeil rose to her feet. Her cheeks were bright with fury. "You've no right," she snapped, "to drag my past here. I've given my life to that castle, and to this village." "You never told us you kent the dead man before," Hamish said mildly. "You never told us you'd worked in the same firm, or that you knew the service corridors well enough to bring him to the loch path when the rest were staring at that daft kiss." A sharp intake of breath swept the pews. "I never went near that cursed path," Mrs. McNeil shouted. Silence dropped like a stone. Even Lugs looked up sharply. Hamish let the words hang. He hadn't said which path, or that it was the service way down toward the loch. Not in this meeting. Around the hall, villagers exchanged startled glances. A few leaned away from her. Someone muttered, "How'd she ken that, then?" Mrs. McNeil seemed to realise what she'd revealed. She jabbed a trembling finger toward Fiona. "Ask her where she was. Ask the girl who lets men paw her. Ask the boy who flew at Hugh like a savage. They're the sinners. Them." Fiona flinched. Donald's face hardened, but he stayed seated. "Enough," Hamish said quietly. He felt the room shifting, a great Highland turning, slow, reluctant, but once it began, unstoppable. Doubt had found its way into the villagers' eyes, and they would carry it home, feed it, pass it along over teacups and shop counters. Mrs. McNeil saw it too. Her mouth trembled before she forced it into a thin line. "You're making fools of them," she whispered. "And yourself." Blair, who had been slouched in the back pretending boredom, leaned forward now, interest pricking in his piggy eyes. Anderson scribbled frantically beside him, though no one could imagine he understood any of it. Hamish nodded once to the room, dismissing them. They shuffled out in clustered knots, whispering hard enough to stir the cold air. Mrs. McNeil did not wait for anyone. She strode past Hamish without a word, shawl clutched like a shield. Outside, dusk had settled early. Villagers stood in little groups on the kirk steps, watching her hurry away. Donald and Fiona slipped off in the opposite direction, shoulders hunched as if expecting stones. Blair sauntered up beside Hamish. "Well, well," he said, "looks like your wee woman has claws after all." Hamish didn't rise to it. He watched the last of the villagers leave, their gossip already spilling into the night, and felt a slow tightening in his gut. He had pushed things forward, but the ground beneath him felt less steady than ever. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish gave him a brief pat. "Aye, boy," he murmured. "We're getting close to something. Just not close enough." Then he locked the kirk door behind him and walked into the dark, the cold following like a question with no answer yet. The following night, Hamish realised the village had turned properly. They had gone home after the meeting, fed the gossip, and come back not to help him, but to see who would be named. They sat in clumps in the kirk hall, coats still on, as if guilt might be catching. No one spoke above a murmur. Even the minister stood stiffly by the hymn-board, looking as though Hamish had dragged him into scandal by brute force. Lugs trotted in first, sniffed the air, and gave Hamish a doubtful look, as if the dog already sensed the whole thing would end badly. "Aye, come in, all of you," Hamish said. "It's not a party this time, but we'll manage." A few grim smiles flickered. Mostly folk kept their coats on. Hogmanay had been ruined, and the idea of a second gathering in the kirk hall felt like tempting fate. Mr. Patel hovered at the back, arms folded, ready to deny everything if questioned. The crofters lined the side wall, looking like men waiting to see which way a court ruling would fall. Fiona and Donald sat together near the door, neither quite touching the other, both wearing the sort of pale, pinched look that came from days of being politely shunned. Hamish cleared his throat. "We'll make a start." At once, chairs scraped as people shifted, ready to bolt if he named the wrong person too quickly. Hamish ignored them. He went to the table where the minister usually laid out leaflets for harvest suppers and baptism forms. Tonight it held nothing. That suited him fine. "We're here," he began, "because the truth of that night has been twisted so many different ways, it's a wonder any of you remember who kissed whom." Nessie Curry cackled. "We all remember that, Hamish." Laughter tried to rise, but shame kept it low. Hamish waited it out. "When the lights came up at the castle," he said, "every eye in the ballroom swung to the centre of the floor. Folk cheered, laughed, made fools of themselves. Good distraction, aye. Better than fireworks." A few villagers narrowed their eyes, already wary. Hamish walked to the middle of the hall. Lugs padded after him, tail stiff. "You were watching the kiss. A daft moment. Sweet enough, maybe, if it had been left alone. But no one looked at the service door. No one looked at the library passage. You were all too busy judging folk for snatching a bit of Hogmanay fun." Donald flushed bright red. Fiona stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Hamish continued, voice flat. "While you were staring there, someone else took their chance." He let the words travel, let the villagers lean in despite themselves. "Hugh," Hamish went on, "kent more than he should. He worked for that chain sniffing around the castle. But before that, years ago, he kent someone else from Glasgow. Someone who didn't think he'd remember her face. Someone who hoped the past had been buried along with the firm that folded after money went missing." Murmurs rippled. Faces turned toward Mrs. McNeil before Hamish even looked at her. She sat straight-backed as always, but her hands clenched the shawl in her lap too tightly for comfort. Hamish kept his tone mild. When Hugh arrived at Tommel Castle, he found figures that didn't match the books. Adjustments. Small at first. Maybe to keep the castle afloat. Maybe to keep someone's comforts in reach. But Hugh recognised the style. He hinted he could expose it. Mrs. McNeil stood abruptly. "You'll not speak to me like that. I've served this village for 30 years. "Aye," Hamish said, "and served it well most days. But you never told us you kent Hugh. Never said he'd had dealings with your old workplace, even when you wrote the rota that put you in 3 different places at once." "That's because I was," she snapped. "A housekeeper works everywhere." "A convenient arrangement," Hamish said quietly. She bristled. "You're twisting everything." Hamish walked slowly to the side door that led to the vestry. Hugh moved through the service corridors more than folk admitted afterward. Someone showed him where to go. Someone who said they wanted a quiet word. Someone who said the kiss would cover their absence. Villagers stiffened. The room felt colder, though no draught blew. Hamish held the door open. He was led out this way, down a stair, maybe arguing, maybe pleading, then to the library. A poker was missing that night, still missing, though we all heard the silly tale about polishing. Mrs. McNeil's face tightened. "We sent it out. I told you." "You told me," Hamish said, "but no one else seems to recall who took it or when. Funny that." A few villagers shifted. Suspicion crept like cold water around their feet. Hamish tapped the frame of the door. Lugg sniffed along the bottom edge, whining at the faint scent of ash. "The first blow," Hamish went on, "wasn't from his fall. Dr. Brodie said that. Traces of peat ash on the wound. The same smell that clings to your shawl, Mrs. McNeil, and your sleeves, and the hearth in the library you tend." She sat heavily, as if her legs had betrayed her. "You've no proof?" "Not quite," Hamish said, "but there's more." He stepped forward, speaking plainly, almost wearily. After the first blow, he was dazed, not dead. Someone helped him outside. You can guide a drunk or injured man if he thinks you're a friend. And once outside, you didn't need much to send him stumbling down a slope. Several villagers crossed themselves instinctively. Mrs. McNeil's lips trembled. "I never—" "He said he'd ruin you," Hamish said softly. "Didn't he? Said he'd tell folk what happened in Glasgow. Maybe tell the Colonel too. Maybe end your job, your place, your pride. And you believed him. You thought stopping him talking would be enough." She rose again, this time with something desperate in her eyes. "He did say that. He came at me in the library after midnight, said the castle was doomed, said folk would be thrown out, said he'd expose everything, even if it meant the whole estate burning to the ground. I only meant to frighten him. I only meant to stop him talking," Hamish finished. For a moment, no one breathed. Even the minister closed his eyes. Then Blair, who had been slumped in the back pretending to nap, sprang upright like a man who'd suddenly remembered his job. "Right, that's enough. Mrs. McNeil, you'll come with us." He strode down the aisle as if he'd solved the whole case by sheer force of smell and spite. Anderson stumbled after him, notebook shaking in his hand. Mrs. McNeil looked around the room, but no villager stepped forward. Respect had carried her for decades, but gossip had stripped that away faster than any evidence. Blair grabbed her arm. "You can tell the rest at Strathbane." "I'm not a murderer," she whispered. "I only meant—" But her voice failed, and Blair hauled her toward the door with self-satisfaction so thick it nearly choked the hall. The villagers began to murmur at once. Relief, shock, and something meaner all twisting together. Hamish watched Fiona and Donald, both still pale, but lighter somehow now that suspicion had shifted. He cleared his throat. "There'll be no charges for you two. The kiss may have been foolish, but it's no crime." That earned a few disapproving huffs. Folk in Lochdu enjoyed moral outrage more than truth. When the hall finally emptied, leaving only stray chairs and the faint smell of damp wool, Hamish locked the door. Luggs nudged his hand, sensing the unease that clung to him. "Aye, boy," Hamish muttered. "It's done, or near enough." They walked back to the station. The loch lay dark beside them, flat and still under the weak moonlight. Not peaceful, just tired. Later, with the peat fire crackling low, Hamish sat in his old chair and poured a dram that barely tasted like whiskey. Luggs settled at his feet with a long sigh. Outside, footsteps crunched on the path. Nessie Curry's voice drifted through the thin window. "I'm telling you," she said to someone invisible, "Hamish watched that kiss far too closely for a policeman." Hamish closed his eyes. The village would talk. It always did. And by morning, the story would grow stranger still. He took another sip from his glass and said nothing at all.